In October 1347, 12 ships sailed into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The people on the docks were expecting trade: spices, silk, grain. What they got instead would kill more people in 4 years than every war of the entire century combined. When the ships were boarded, almost every sailor on board was already dead. The few still alive were covered in black, swollen lumps the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus. Their skin was turning dark, almost black, as if it were rotting while they were still breathing. The horrified dock workers tried to push the ships back out to sea. It was already too late. Within 5 years, this single moment, 12 ships, 1 harbor, would erase nearly half the population of an entire continent. Entire towns would vanish. Children would be born and die before anyone learned their names. And to this day, scientists are still trying to fully explain how something this small did something this big. This is the story of the Black Death. To understand how the plague became unstoppable, you have to go back further, not to Sicily, but to the steppes of Central Asia, years earlier. Buried in the soil and the fur of wild rodents was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. For centuries, it had quietly lived in flea populations, jumping between marmots and rats, mostly undisturbed by humans. But the 1300s changed everything. The Mongol Empire had built the largest connected trade network the world had ever seen, the Silk Road. Goods, animals, and people moved faster and farther than any point in human history. And so did the fleas. Historians believe the plague first exploded among Mongol soldiers during the siege of the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346. According to one chilling and disputed account, the Mongol army began catapulting the plague-ridden corpses of their own dead over the city walls. It may be one of the first recorded uses of biological warfare in human history. Genoese merchants trapped inside the besieged city fled by ship, desperate to escape. They didn't realize they were carrying something far worse than fear with them. Those ships were heading straight for Europe. Once it reached Messina, the plague didn't just spread, it detonated. From Sicily, it moved into mainland Italy. From Italy into France. From France into England, Spain, Germany, and eventually Scandinavia and Russia. Within 2 years, almost no corner of Europe had been untouched. Nobody understood what was happening, and that ignorance made everything worse. Doctors at the time believed disease spread through bad air, called miasma. Physicians wore strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, believing the scent would protect them. It didn't. Many of them died wearing those exact masks. Religious leaders called it divine punishment for humanity's sins. In response, groups called flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, begging God for mercy. Historians believe these processions, where infected travelers moved through crowded towns, may have actually helped spread the disease faster. And the symptoms themselves were the stuff of nightmares. First came the fever, chills, and exhaustion. Then the swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, would appear in the armpits, neck, and groin, growing to the size of apples. In the most severe cases, the skin would turn black from internal bleeding, giving the disease its now famous name. Death could come in as little as 24 hours. For some, it came within hours of the first symptom appearing. There was no cure. There was no understanding. There was only the waiting, wondering if you or your children or your neighbors would be next. By 1348, entire towns across Europe had stopped functioning. Farmers died in their fields, leaving crops to rot. Livestock wandered the countryside with no one left to herd them. Priests, whose job it was to perform last rites, were dying faster than they could bury the bodies. And in many towns, priests simply refused to visit the sick at all, terrified of catching the disease themselves. Mass graves, later called plague pits, were dug outside cities because cemeteries had run out of room. In some towns, so many people died so quickly that bodies were left in the streets for days. Trade collapsed, economies crumbled. In England alone, some historians estimate nearly half the population died within just a few years. Across Europe as a whole, estimates range from 30% to 60% of the entire population, tens of millions of people, gone, in a window of time shorter than most modern political terms. And in the panic, people searched for someone to blame. In several European cities, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. This led to horrific waves of violence and mass killings, even though Jewish communities were dying from the plague at similar rates to everyone else. Fear, it turns out, doesn't need facts. It just needs a target. Society wasn't just dying. It was tearing itself apart from the inside. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. By 1351, the worst of the plague had passed, but its effects would reshape Europe for centuries. With nearly half the population gone, there were suddenly far fewer workers available. This gave surviving peasants and laborers something they'd never had before: leverage. They began demanding higher wages and better treatment from landowners who desperately needed workers to survive. Some historians argue this shift in power helped weaken the feudal system that had dominated Europe for hundreds of years, eventually paving the way toward the Renaissance. In other words, one of humanity's darkest chapters may have accidentally helped trigger one of its greatest periods of art, science, and progress. But the plague itself never fully disappeared. It returned in smaller waves for the next 300 years, flaring up generation after generation, a recurring nightmare nobody could permanently escape. And here's the part that still puzzles scientists today. Even with modern DNA analysis confirming Yersinia pestis as the cause, researchers are still debating exactly why this outbreak was so catastrophically fast and deadly compared to later, smaller waves of plague. Was it a more aggressive strain? Unique climate conditions? A perfect storm of trade routes, malnutrition, and overcrowded cities? Even with everything we know now, some pieces of the Black Death's full story remain unsolved. It's strange to think that something invisible, smaller than a grain of sand, could bring an entire continent to its knees. No army did this, no invasion, no war. Just fleas, rats, and a few ships that should have been turned away. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it rewrote the rules of an entire civilization, its economy, its religion, its art, its future. And somewhere, in a quiet stretch of soil in Central Asia, the same bacterium that caused all of this still exists today in small, controlled outbreaks, watched closely by modern scientists who understand exactly how dangerous it remains. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the smallest things are usually the ones we should be watching most closely. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, you're going to want to see what happens in our next video, because the next pandemic on our list might be even stranger than this one.